From a circle to a sphere, we're going to take a flat shape, this time a circle, and add form using shading and different values to create a sphere. And so I just want to explain how this works before I show you the technique. You need to have a couple different values in specific areas to make it work correctly. You always have a highlight where the light source hits the strongest. And then as the values spread out, they get darker and darker. And so right next to the highlight, we have very light values and they start to get to medium to a dark. And those mid-tones are where you get from that light to medium. And the darkest value on the object is the coarse shadow. Now below you'll see a reflected light. That is because light will bounce off the surface the object is sitting on and reflect back up. But again, it's muted, so it's not going to be bright like your light middle tones, and it won't be as dark as the coarse shadow. But it's the area where, and that usually against the edge, that separates the coarse shadow from the cast shadow. Now the cast shadow is just the shadow that reflects from the object onto the surface.
Okay, before we start shading the sphere, let's talk about the tools and the pencils that I'm using. These are shading pencils, and so the first pencil I'm using is an HB. And then I have a 2B, which is a little bit darker, a 4B, again darker, and a 6B, which is our darkest. What makes the B pencils darker is how they compress the graphite. The looser it's compressed, the more graphite that gets grabbed onto the paper, and then it makes a darker shade. So what you have to be careful of is when you're shading is the dust that's left behind from the 4 and the 6B, because it is loose. You want to make sure and blow that off your paper instead of wiping it off, because it can smudge. What I'm doing here is I'm using the same amount of pressure as I'm shading each pencil, and then I lighten up that pressure so that I get a nice even gradient from dark to light. And I just like to show you that variety. The difference between each pencil matters when you're adding darker values versus lighter values, but I also love to shade a sphere or do exercises like this with just one pencil. This just gives you an idea of the type of value and contrast you can get with the 4 different pencils. So here I'm going to draw just a flat circle, and then I'm going to draw my cast shadow, and then I lightly outline, you can't even really see it, the highlight, where that's where my light source hits my object the brightest. Then I'm going to take my HB pencil, my lightest pencil, and I'm just giving myself a nice even coat, really, really light pressure. Now I'm not scribbling huge scribbles back and forth, but I'm doing it nice and controlled, and I'm changing direction and overlapping, even pressure everywhere. The one thing I'm going to show you right here is you don't want to do the same direction and barely overlap that you have this weird edge. That's a no-no. We want it to be blended where we can't see the real pencil marks. The other thing that you don't want to do, if you saw my second X, is I took my finger and I blended it. That smudges and you don't have control. It flattens the value and your oils from your fingers, oh, it's just so bad. If you're like, no, I insist on blending, there's blending sticks, you can use a Q-tip, so many things with more control. I tend to just use a pencil. I really like the contrast that I get. So now I'm going back through and I'm doing a little bit more pressure with my HB and changing direction and overlapping, and then I'm going to switch to my 2B and add more layers and more layers of value until I get a contrast. And then I go back through with my HB and I'm going to start surrounding that coarse shadow and blending it into the highlight area so I don't have stripes of values, right? I want it to gradually blend where I'm not even noticing how the value is changing. The one thing you've got to be careful, sometimes it's nice to sharpen your pencil so that those edges don't get too fuzzy. The other thing you want to be careful with your edge is that you don't have a line. The problem with real life is we don't have outlines like a cartoon. That's not a problem, it's just a fact, I guess, right? So make sure that you're blending all of your edges. If it's a dark line, then blend that. Blend it from dark to light. See, against my highlighted area, I don't have just a line. It's an edge that will have a gradient. What a gradient is, it is a gradual transition of dark to light. Now I'm just adding more value to the core area, and then if you'll notice on the bottom, I have a reflected light. That's light that bounces off the surface and hits the bottom so that it doesn't just sit flat shadow, my dark core shadow on the object right against my cast shadow. That makes it look rounded and three-dimensional. If you forget that reflected light, it really flattens your object out. The problem some people run into is they leave that reflected light so bright, it almost looks like the highlighted area. Remember, it is bouncing off a surface, so it needs to be shades darker. Now what I'm doing is I'm shading in my cast shadow. The cast shadow I do with the solid 6B, but it looks a little grainy, so I go back in with my kind of a harder pencil like my HB that's more compressed, and then I go over all that value and it fills in those little gaps. The other thing people will forget is those middle tones between the highlighted area and your core shadow. Those need to be gradual. You should have 2 or 3, sometimes 4 different values between that highlight and your core shadow. If you can get those down, you'll have a really nice blended object. I would say, safe bet, try and have 3 or 4 values at least. Okay, good luck. I love this exercise. It's great review. It's a great way to learn how to shade any object if you can do the sphere.